Accordingly, we may always safely assume that crimes forbidden by law are crimes which many men have a natural propensity to commit. If there were no such propensity, there would be no such crimes, and if no such crimes were committed, what need to forbid them? Instead of assuming, therefore, from the legal prohibition of incest that there is a natural aversion to incest, we ought rather to assume that there is a natural instinct in favor of it, and if the law represses it, it does so because civilized men have come to the conclusion that the satisfaction of these natural instincts is detrimental to the general interests of society." To this valuable argument of Frazer's I can add that the experiences of psychoanalysis make the assumption of such an innate aversion to incestuous relations altogether impossible. They have taught, on the contrary, that the first sexual impulses of the young are regularly of an incestuous nature, and that such repressed impulses play a role which can hardly be overestimated as the motive power of later neuroses. The interpretation of incest dread as an innate instinct must therefore be abandoned. The same holds true of another derivation of the incest prohibition which counts many supporters, namely the assumption that primitive races very soon observed the dangers with which inbreeding threatened their race, and that they therefore had decreed the incest prohibition with a conscious purpose. The objections to this attempted explanation crowd upon each other. Not only must the prohibition of incest be older than all breeding of domestic animals, from which men could derive experience of the effect of inbreeding upon the characteristics of the breed, but the harmful consequences of inbreeding are not established beyond all doubt even today, and in man they can be shown only with difficulty. Besides, everything that we know about contemporaneous savages makes it very improbable that the thoughts of their far removed ancestors should already have been occupied with preventing injury to their later descendants. It sounds almost ridiculous to attribute hygienic and eugenic motives, such as have hardly yet found consideration in our culture, to these children of the race who lived without thought of the morrow. And finally, it must be pointed out that a prohibition against inbreeding as an element weakening to the race, which is imposed from practical hygienic motives, seems quite inadequate to explain the deep abhorrence which our society feels against incest. This dread of incest, as I have shown elsewhere, seems to be even more active and stronger among primitive races living today than among the civilized. In inquiring into the origin of incest dread, it could be expected that here also there is the choice between possible explanations of a sociological, biological, and psychological nature, in which the psychological motives might have to be considered as representative of biological forces. Still, in the end, one is compelled to subscribe to Frazer's resigned statement, namely that we do not know the origin of incest dread, and do not even know how to guess at it. None of the solutions of the riddle thus far advanced seems satisfactory to us. I must mention another attempt to explain the origin of incest dread, which is of an entirely different nature from those considered up to now. It might be called a historic explanation. This attempt is associated with the hypothesis of Charles Darwin about the primal social state of man. From the habits of the higher apes, Darwin concluded that man too lived originally in small hordes in which the jealousy of the oldest and strongest male prevented sexual promiscuity. "We may indeed conclude, from what we know of the jealousy of all male quadrupeds, armed, as many of them are, with special weapons for battling with their rivals, that promiscuous intercourse in a state of nature is extremely improbable. If we therefore look back far enough into the stream of time, and judging from the social habits of man as he now exists, the most probable view is that he originally lived in small communities, each with a single wife, or if powerful, with several, whom he jealously defended against all other men. Or he may not have been a social animal and yet have lived with several wives, like the gorilla, for all the natives "agree that only the adult male is seen in a band. When the young male grows up a contest takes place for mastery, and the strongest, by killing and driving out the others, establishes himself as the head of the community." Dr. Savage in the Boston Journal of Natural History, Volume 5, 1845-47. The younger males being thus driven out and wandering about would also, when at last successful in finding a partner, prevent too close inbreeding within the limits of the same family. Atkinson seems to have been the first to recognize that these conditions of the Darwinian primal horde would in practice bring about the exogamy of the young men. Each one of those driven away could found a similar horde in which, thanks to jealousy of the chief, the same prohibition as to sexual intercourse obtained, and in the course of time these conditions would have brought about the rule which is now known as law: no sexual intercourse with the members of the horde. After the advent of Totemism, the rule would have changed into a different form: no sexual intercourse within the totem. Andrew Lang declared himself in agreement with this explanation of exogamy, but in the same book he advocates the other theory of Durkheim, which explains exogamy as a consequence of the totem laws. It is not altogether easy to combine the two interpretations. In the first case, exogamy would have existed before totemism; in the second case, it would be a consequence of it. Section 3. Into this darkness psychoanalytic experience throws one single ray of light. The relation of the child to animals has much in common with that of primitive man. The child does not yet show any trace of the pride which afterwards moves the adult civilized man to set a sharp dividing line between his own nature and that of all other animals. The child unhesitatingly attributes full equality to animals. He probably feels himself more closely related to the animal than to the undoubtedly mysterious adult, in the freedom with which he acknowledges his needs. Not infrequently a curious disturbance manifests itself in this excellent understanding between child and animal. The child suddenly begins to fear a certain animal species and to protect himself against seeing or touching any individual of this species. There results the clinical picture of an animal phobia, which is one of the most frequent among the psychoneurotic diseases of this age, and perhaps the earliest form of such an ailment. The phobia is as a rule in regard to animals for which the child has until then shown the liveliest interest and has nothing to do with the individual animal. In cities the choice of animals which can become the object of phobia is not great. They are horses, dogs, cats, more seldom birds, and strikingly often very small animals, like bugs and butterflies. Sometimes animals which are known to the child only from picture books and fairy stories become objects of the senseless and inordinate anxiety which is manifested with these phobias. It is seldom possible to learn the manner in which such an unusual choice of anxiety has been brought about. I am indebted to Dr. Carl Abraham for the report of a case in which the child itself explained its fear of wasps by saying that the color and the stripes of the body of the wasp had made it think of the tiger, of which from all that it had heard it might well be afraid. The animal phobias have not yet been made the object of careful analytical investigation, although they very much merit it. The difficulties of analyzing children of so tender an age have probably been the motive of such neglect. It cannot therefore be asserted that the general meaning of these illnesses is known, and I myself do not think that it would turn out to be the same in all cases. But a number of such phobias, directed against larger animals, have proved accessible to analysis and have thus betrayed their secret to the investigator. In every case it was the same. The fear at bottom was of the father, if the children examined were boys. and was merely displaced upon the